Hello everyone, welcome to episode 40 of the Drunken Boxing Podcast, coming to you from a suddenly autumn Beijing. I hope you are all doing well as we transition into the season of White Walkers and runny noses. Alrighty, let's get into some Mushin martial culture news. I released a discussion lesson from the Huang Jing online learning program to the general public on my YouTube channel. The topic of discussion in that video was the purpose and meaning of training, and I share some of my own perspectives and experiences over the course of my training life. The impetus for this discussion was a question someone had asked me regarding motivation and goals and what to do when you lose sight of why you are training, which I think is a very important topic, as I have seen many people give up after years of training only to regret it later. So have a listen to the discussion, and by all means let me know your thoughts. I also released episode 5 of the story of Baguazhang. This episode features the famed Republican-era Xingyi Quan and Baguazhang master Sun Lutang, who went on to synthesize these arts along with Taiji Quan to create his combined practice of Sun-style Taiji. This episode covers his history and anecdotes regarding various occurrences within it. It also explains his Bagua practice and how this was integrated into his combined art. It is a lengthy episode with a lot of dialogue from his granddaughter, the over 90 years of age Sun Wanrong. This episode took a while to produce simply due to the sheer volume of dialogue that I had to translate and then subtitle for the episode. Do go check it out, and I hope you enjoy it. There are still 3 more episodes to come within this series. In other news, I designed a new t-shirt which features the legendary technical exchange that took place between Guo Yunshen and Che Yizhai, both being Xingyi Quan masters and disciples of the art's founder, Li Luoneng. This is one of the most well-known events in the art's history, and arguably its most famous photo was a result of this event. I'm quite happy with how the design came out, and there are a few different colors available. Purchasing any of the Mushin martial culture merchandise is one way you can support this podcast and my YouTube channel endeavors as well. I'm still running a promotion on the Mushin merchandise store where you can get a 10% discount on any purchases by using the promo code SUMMER22 at the checkout. This promotion will end at the end of this month. The store can be found on Teespring at the link listed here and in the show notes. Another way to support my work is through Patreon. There are general support tiers through which you can do that. Any and all support is highly appreciated. Additionally, there is also a third tier, the Hua Jin tier, in which you can study the arts of Xingyi Quan and Baguazhang in depth. There is already a vast library of released lesson videos for both Xingyi Quan and Baguazhang, as well as their related Neigong and other practices. So, if you are interested in learning Xingyi Quan or Baguazhang, give the course a try. The Patreon site may be found at patreon.com/Mushin Martial Culture. That's Mushin Martial Culture, all one word. Alright, let's get into today's podcast. My guest today is Dennis Rovere. I first came to know about him through a book he published in around the year 2008 called The Xingyi Quan of the Chinese Army. This wonderful book was a translation of Xingyi Quan Master Huang Bonians' military manual from 1928. I really enjoyed this book and have always wanted to have a chat with Dennis Rovere, and I'm glad we finally did just that. Dennis Roveray is the last senior martial arts student of Colonel Chang Xiang Wu, who was a former chief instructor of military strategy and Xingyi Quan at the Central Military Academy in Nanjing, known as the Huang Pu Military Academy. Mr. Roveray has recognition from the Taiwanese government as a martial arts instructor, and he has also received a presidential award for culture from their special forces and recon commandos. He has also trained with the Wu Jing military police and Gong public security bureaus in the People's Republic of China. He has authored 2 books on the Chinese martial arts, namely the previously mentioned The Xingyi Quan of the Chinese Army, as well as one titled Chinese Military Police, Knife, Baton, and Weapon Techniques. Apart from his lifelong practice of Xingyi Quan and his involvement in teaching the military, he is also an architect and a court-qualified expert witness in the use of force and standards of training and care. I had a great time chatting to him and learning about his background and life experiences. So with that, I give you Mr. Dennis Rovere. Welcome to the Drunken Boxing Podcast, Mr. Dennis Rovere, all the way from Calgary. How are you doing today?
I'm excellent. How about you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for being a guest on the podcast. I've been actually wanting to talk to you for many years now. I first came to know about you through your book that I think you published in, I think it was around 2008 or so, through Blue Snake Books. Was it around that time?
Yes, Xingyi Quan of the Chinese Army.
Yes, which is a
Yes.
translation with additional information, commentary, explanation from yourself of Huang Bonians' Xingyi Quan manual, which was actually an instruction manual, if I'm not mistaken, for the Republican era army military training.
Yes. He originally did it in 1928,
Right.
and he actually taught the rifle and bayonet portion in 1931. He was a guest instructor at the Central Military Academy, or the rename of Wampo. Originally Wampo when it was in the south, and then Central Military Academy when it went to Nanjing.
Yeah.
And my teacher was an instructor at the military academy. So he came out of Wampo. He was, I think, third or fourth graduating class. And then he was a military Xingyi instructor, because they taught Xingyi as their close combat. And he also taught military strategy for the nationalists.
Who was your teacher? I mean, we can maybe if you'd like, we could begin with a bit of a background about yourself and your background and your history.
Okay, it's pretty long. I was doing a chronology preparing for this.
Good.
I kind of got lost in the dates and things, so some of them are approximates within a year or two. So I started in 1972, I was already in university. I was doing an undergraduate degree in Chinese archaeology.
Wow.
I specialized in oracle bone and Chinese bronzes, the fast-paced world. And then after I graduated, I went to architecture school. So I'm actually an architect by profession. Like I've taught martial arts, but I've never done it, to make a living or ran a school in that sense. I met my teachers when I was 20. So that was 1972. And they had just come from Taiwan to Canada, and they were teaching a Tai Chi class. And a friend of mine, Nancy Lee, said, "You're always interested in martial arts. Why don't you go and learn Tai Chi?" So I did. And I really didn't know anything about them. I mean, I trained with him from 72 to 1988.
Okay.
And I trained regularly with him, and then when they moved to the coast for health reasons, I would venture out every year and train with them there. But he was from Shantung province, and he was a Tai Chi Xingyi Bagua practitioner. And he, I guess Xingyi was his main style, but he did Tai Chi. He also did Bagua, but not that much. I learned Bagua from him, but it was sort of at the end of his teaching career.
I see.
He was a military instructor, late 20s, till fought in the Japanese War, fought in the Chinese Civil War. He was wounded twice.
Wow.
And then he ended up in Taiwan. But he knew and trained with most of the famous people that you hear about. Chu Guofu, who won the, I think, 1928 tournament, Nanjing tournament. He and his brothers trained with my teacher in Xingyi Quan.
Wow.
So he started his Tai Chi training with the Yang family in 1915. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because when he started with training, they actually taught it as a martial art. So you would learn the form, but you also learn the application of the form.
Crazy idea, that, huh?
But I'm sorry?
That's a crazy idea, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Hard to believe that there's actually application.
Yeah.
Some people would say all martial arts in China came from dance, but I would debate
theater.
that one.
There's some
Theater,
crazy
yes,
ideas about that instead of the other way around. But let's not get into that.
Yeah, we'll stay away from that, and we won't mention names, even though we have a list that. But by the time I was asking him, this was in 1988 when I actually got to ask him all the questions I wanted to ask him once. Okay. Because they never really talked about their time in the military. He and his wife, when they went to Taiwan, did not teach martial arts. In fact, none of his children learned martial arts from them. But what he told me was in 1915, when he was learning Tai Chi, they actually taught applications. And then by 1928, 29, when he was going into the military school, he said they had stopped teaching. They did Tuisho, and that was sort of the only application, if you want to call it that, but the only sort of
agonistic practice.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Which it's so my Tai Chi training is actually a lot different than I would say most of the people that I know who do Tai Chi, because they go through the, they do the motions, and exercise is fine, and but there's kind of a missing link in there. And because I was doing a PhD in kinesiology, I was looking at this kind of situation where in the olden days you had exercise, application, and you could figure out what worked, what didn't work, what was effective, what was efficient, and what was just garbage or ineffective, I guess. I shouldn't be so harsh. Yeah. But nowadays, everybody who does Tai Chi, it's kind of everything goes, pick and choose whatever you want, make up your own stuff, because there's no sort of link between the movement and the application. And as a kinesiologist, if you look at biomechanics, efficiency of movement, you can actually gauge that. Yes. Some type of movement is more mechanically efficient than the other. Well, you know what I'm talking about because of your background. Yeah. So I'm not telling you anything new, but I think that's where sort of the Tai Chi fell apart.
Well, it's interesting you put it that way, because that's always been, even from my teachers teaching to me, has always been the underlying, barometer, if you will, is the usage, and then the ability to use it more or less effectively. So you have the technique, you have a way to do it, but then you have to be able to test it and feel it for yourself. And then everything will become pretty clear, not just simply saying this is how you use it, but also where is the placement of your structure, your elbows, your hands, your wrists, your knees, the angling of your waist, the weight distribution. Where is it more effective and where is it less effective? And this is actually how you should be refining your techniques. I mean, and if you're missing that, you're kind of like a ship without a compass or without a keel, let's say. You're going to be
with a rudder. Yeah.
Yeah.
No. And yeah. No, continue. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No problem. No problem. So that you're 100% spot on. I remember having discussions about this with local officials in the the professional wushu kind of environment, and watching them and discussing with them, and when they would say things like, "Oh, this guy's technique is gui fan." Gui fan means correct, the correct method.
Yes. No, I know that.
Yeah, and this guy's isn't. And I would say to them, "What are you basing that on?" I mean, literally, what are you basing that on? I wasn't saying he's right or wrong. I was just asking, you said this is gui fan, and why is that one not? He's like, oh no, because the hand isn't here and there. And I said, yes, but why is the hand there? And a lot of them wouldn't be able to answer. So I'm like, yeah, the hand's there for the function. So if you're removing, if you just simply taught the guy the function, he would put his hand in the right place. It's pretty simple, So, I think you're right about that.
Yeah. So initially when I learned Tai Chi, we did the form. But after we learned the form, and I sort of became one of his pet students, like I'm his last senior student, actually.
Okay.
He would take it and we'd break it down, and he'd go through and he'd say, okay, this is what this is for, and this is how you apply that. And this is why this hand or elbow has, like the elbow's close to the body and all that. It was for mechanical efficiency. So you're not using Tai Chi as brute force. You're using Tai Chi as a refined martial art.
Yeah. And that elbow issue is even more critical within Xingyi Quan. It's one of the the commandments of the practice. So, which also seems to have been lost today.
Yes, and he was primarily a Xingyi Quan practitioner. So his wife was a martial artist. So he was a colonel in the army.
We haven't said his name.
And his wife was...
We haven't actually mentioned his name.
Chang Xiang Wu.
Okay, there we go.
Sorry.
No problem.
I thought I had. But, okay. But his wife... So he was a colonel, and his wife was a major in the Nationalist Army. And she was the commando instructor at Changsha. So she trained Chinese commandos and the militia for war.
Wow.
This was in the early 30s, just before Japan. Now, her whole family were martial artists, and she's also from Shandong. And her brother was a provincial champion, and his specialty was a 3-section whip.
Ah.
And she was a senior student of Du Shunwu.
Okay.
Du Shunwu. I get mixed up with Cantonese and Mandarin because my wife's Cantonese speaker. So.
Okay.
Du Shunwu. He was a bodyguard to Sun Yat-sen.
Oh, right.
And he was a national hero. Anyhow, she was Wan Laisheng was a famous student of his.
Right.
And she was actually friends with Wan Laisheng. And there's a family connection with Du, but I'm not sure what it is because all of their children never really followed sort of the history and things. And his grandson and I, who I've known for over 40 years, he and I trained a bit back in the 70s.
Oh, that's amazing.
We're talking about these kinds of things. And he's missing a bunch of... I actually had more information on his grandparents than he did. I had film footage that I transferred to DVD for him and photos. But he gave me a set of photos, which I'll send some of them to you. You can put on your podcast of them, my teachers in their military graduation uniforms. Mrs. Chang is with several members of the training team for the militia and some of that stuff, which I think your listeners might find interesting.
For sure.
And So he was a colonel, she was a major, but she ran the house.
As is the case.
Yeah.
People don't realize that here.
Yeah, even though he outran. Yeah. Yeah. But he was very well respected. Chan Dongsheng, who's the Sui Jiao.
Yeah.
Sui Jiao.
Yeah.
And he were very, very good friends. They had been in the military together, and they were friends up until they passed away.
Wow.
And Adam Hsu, actually, I sent a note, this is many years ago, I sent a note to Adam Hsu and I said, "Hi, I'm Dennis Roveray, I'm in Canada, this is my teacher." And he right away, he responded and said, "Oh yes, your teacher's very well known, sort of in the military martial art circuit, and he's a very good friend of Chan Dongsheng."
Well, I really like Adam Hsu as well. I spent an afternoon with him in Taiwan drinking tea and talking about martial arts, I think 5 or 6 years ago. And I also like the fact that he doesn't bite his lip. He just says whatever the hell he thinks. And somebody was with us that was from the official movement here, the official sporting movement, and we sat down and we were talking, and Adam Hsu just told him exactly what he thought about everything and what was wrong and what was right and what needed to be changed and why. And, at the end of the day, some people don't like to hear the truth. It kind of annoyed the guy. And he told me that afterwards. He was like, all the stuff that he said is just, I didn't like it. I said, yeah, but why? Again, why didn't you like it? And he couldn't answer that question.
Yeah, of course.
So anyway, yeah.
Never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Exactly.
So
your teacher's wife, you said that she had through her background. So as a martial artist with that connection, was she? Because I know Wan Laisheng called his system Ziranmen, if I'm not mistaken.
Ziranmen and Liu Hechuan.
All right. So is that her practice that she did as
yes.
well? Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And her family did Liu Hechuan. That's her main style.
Okay.
So I actually learned some of it. The only thing I still practice is the Tam Tui.
Okay.
From Shandong, the Liu Hechuan version. which there's kind of an interesting thing. Now, I'm not a historian. I mean, I was an archaeologist, but now that I'm retired, because I'm in my 70s, I have an opportunity to go back and actually do some research and sort of fill in all the blanks.
Nice.
But Chu Guofu wrote a book in the late 1920s on Liu He Tam Tui. And a friend of mine sent it to me and said, oh, you know who these guys are. And I looked at it and I said, oh, yeah, I learned this stuff, and I still practice it. There's only certain things I practice nowadays, but because I'm lazy and old. So
it's understandable. How many lines is that Tan Tui?
That's 12.
12 road, huh? Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you get 10 roads, you get 12 roads, you get variations, even with the character Tan, which is quite interesting.
So they say this is Tam.
Okay.
So it's a family name, also a place in Shantung.
Right.
So that's as opposed to Tan, which is the springing legs.
Yeah. So that is the other side of it. There's this idea of some dragon pond where the name actually came from. Some attribute it to Shaolin Dragon Pond, which is also that character. And I've met some people here in Beijing that do Tan Tui as a system. It's an actual full system. They have, it's not just lines of spring kick, but they have a full system. And I've spent an afternoon with them as well. The teacher was talking to me about their history and then their principles of their practice, etc. It's very interesting. And they have the attribution, of course, to a Shaolin monk. So when I went to their training location, he's got this gigantic mural on the wall of this purported monk. A nice painting, but interesting history.
Right. So I learned some of that from her. And I learned Tan Tui totally by accident, because when we were doing the Tai Chi class, it was like, there was an introduction in Chinatown. They came to Canada and they wanted to kind of integrate them into Chinatown, so they opened this Tai Chi class. And the first round of classes, there was only 2 non-Chinese in the class. There was like 80 Chinese people. There was myself and my girlfriend that I dragged along at the time. But during the break from the Tai Chi, Mrs. Chang would take all the little kids and they were doing Tam Tui. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. So I got up and I'm doing it with them, right? And so she kind of looked at me strangely. And I ended up learning. And again, all of I learned Lembu Chuan from her and Tam Tui and a couple other forms that I don't really practice. But again, everything was, you learn the form and then you learn the applications, and that's how you refine, the movements. So it's not just like you see a lot of people. I was at a tournament a couple months ago and they do the demonstration and you could tell immediately that they really don't understand what they're doing. Because they were never taught applications. And I'd go up and query the people in a polite way and say, the lady was doing Gong Lei Chuan, right? Which I learned. I learned the Northern Eagle Claw style. That's another story we can talk about later. Okay. But I said to her, oh, you're doing Gong Lei Chuan. I said, most people, don't see that. And she said, oh, yes, da-da-da-da-da. But when she performed it, it was kind of a dog's breakfast Gong Lei Chuan. It was, and I was like, didn't you learn applications? And she said, oh, no, we just do the forms. It's for health exercise and camaraderie and whatever else. But,
I don't understand that. I mean, I understand people not being interested or not focusing on the applications. That's fine. And their reasons for practicing could be health, etc. And that's also fine. But I do think either way, when it's being taught, at least explain the principles of the technique's function when you're teaching it, because that drives intention. And then half of the physical and other benefits you get are a result of that intent. So even if they're not practicing it with any ideas or, any goals of function, as long as they know the application, just even at a rudimentary basis, it's going to change the practice for the better, actually. I mean, so I find it strange that if somebody says, no, we only practice for health, that's fine. You don't have to practice it to an extremely high level, but at least have some inkling of understanding of what the technique is for, and then it'll be clear. As I said earlier, you'll do it correctly. and then from there it's up to you.
But the problem there is most of the instructors don't actually know the application. It turned out I knew this woman's teacher, and he never learned application. So, so you have that. I think that's one problem, is you have people who don't know the application, so they don't bother. Anything goes. And then you have the other group who make up the applications.
Right.
And you immediately see that, it wouldn't really work in a struggle. That's when I was training with the military, both in Taiwan and then in mainland China in the 90s. They did Sanda, or they did Xingyi Quan.
Yeah.
Xingyi Quan, which
military.
Is common.
Yeah.
Yeah. Military fist.
My wife is an ex-military. She was Chinese Special Forces, but she was she was specifically recruited for her martial arts background. So she represented them in martial arts. So her family has a similar background. They were a martial arts family. Her grandfather was a Republican-era soldier who served with Fu Ziyi. I'm sure you know the General Fu Ziyi.
Yeah.
And they fought from their hometown, which is Shanxi, all the way into Inner Mongolia. Then the war.
Holy cow.
Yeah, and that's where they remained there. The grandfather remained there, and that's why she was from there. But she was also in the military, and they did this, as you said, those basic practices.
Yeah, the 4 GMT forms. Yeah. But again, you're learning a form, and then you're learning application, and then you're using it.
Yeah.
So like when my teachers taught in the military, they would typically, maybe the Xingyi Quan, because they didn't teach the whole Xingyi forms. They did the 5/5 linking form and then some weapons, because they didn't have a lot of time. They're training guys and then sending them out, to fight. But they would say 1 month was all your basics, empty hand, your basic saber, because they taught saber and rifle and bayonet. That would be 1 month. Second month would be application, and then third month would be freestyle fighting. And when I asked him about that, I said, what happens in the fighting? He said, well, if you get hurt, better you got hurt there than when you're on the battlefield, because it could cost everybody their lives.
Yeah.
So they were so I came up through this mindset, I guess you could say, of it's real stuff and you're going to use it. Whether you use it or not is secondary, but you have to understand all these underlying principles and how to maximize your force and those kinds of things. So my kind of approach, and I'm at odds with a lot of people. This is why I don't mind talking to you. I don't talk to most martial artists, because my way of thinking is a little different than theirs. But it's interesting because I spent a number of years, like 7 or 8 years, training Canadian special operations, reconnaissance, peacekeepers during the Bosnian War. And these are guys that are going into combat or going into a place where combat is a reality, but you're not allowed to engage without the enemy shooting at you first, which sometimes is not a good idea, and I trained. So they liked me. I got a bunch of citations from the Canadian military. I was invited to train U.S. Special Forces in 2000, and the Israelis wanted me in 1976. They tried to get me because they wanted to see sort of my approach to training, and that's a Guanxi kind of connection. That's
how did you get into all of that? I mean, we've kind of glossed over your why that emerged and how that came to fruition. How did you get involved in all of that?
How did I get? Wow, that's a very long story. So I got my I got an instructor certification from my teacher in the mid 70s, and which was very nice of him to give it to me. I didn't think I was ready for teaching. I was teaching some Tai Chi classes, and actually I ran. In terms of Tai Chi, I ran the first government-sponsored Tai Chi program in North America for senior citizens.
Oh, okay.
Somebody knew that I taught Tai Chi, and they went and saw my class, and they chatted with me. I was doing a continuing ed class at the university, teaching. And my teacher and I had taught it prior. And then when he left, I took it over. And they came to me and said, "Oh, would you be interested in doing this senior citizens program?" And I thought, sure, why not? And so the Canadian government, Department of Health and Welfare at the time it was called, sponsored the program, and they paid for all the classes, and they set up all the classes in the various senior centers. And we had a filmmaker who did like a 5-minute film promo, and even though it was my class, I think I'm in there for like 20 seconds. What they did is they talked to all the seniors and the nice old ladies with the silver hair, and they talked about how great it was and da 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 da. And that ran for several years. And then because I was going off to architecture school in the United States, I had to put that on hold. But at that time, I had some friends who were connected with the Israeli military. A good friend of mine who's now an Orthodox rabbi in Israel, his buddy was the director of physical training. He was a general. He was the head of physical training for the IDF.
Wow.
And he said, "Oh, you should come and meet my friend Dennis Rovere. He trained with the Chinese military instructors." And the Israelis were interested because there was having problems in Syria, places like that, where the communist bloc countries were giving training to their Arab opponents.
Right.
I don't want to talk about this too much because I don't want to get into politics. I'm an Italian Roman Catholic, just so we're clear. I don't want to, and I'm not really political, but anyhow, the general came and my friend came, and they brought a guy with them who turned out was a member of the Golani Brigade. He fought in the Yom Kippur War, and he was a pretty fit guy. And so they asked me some questions about the training, and he said, "Oh, could you do a demonstration?" So I said, "Oh yeah, okay, no problem." I thought they wanted me to, do a form or something like that, something innocuous. And they said, "Oh, we want you to try this guy out." And the guy came at me, and lucky I was awake because he would have broken my jawbone. He did a spinning knife hand strike at my face, and
oh shit!
I stepped back, and he thought I was going to retreat. And when I stepped back, he stepped forward, and I stepped into him. I kicked him, heel kick in the chest, in the base of the sternum as hard as I could. And he was down on the ground. He couldn't even get up, right? So they said, "Oh, that's pretty good stuff. You should come and work for us." But I turned them down. I went to the U.S. and became an architect instead. So.
Okay, that's very interesting.
But when I came back, I was still I practiced all the time. I try and train every day. Some days are better than others, but I always try and do something because I think it's good for me mentally as well as physically. And I don't like to forget things, even though I can only do so much. So there's a lot of stuff I learned I don't practice at all.
It is like that, though.
But yeah. But so that was around 1976. And I have to kind of back up. When I was training with my teachers, the company that I worked for as a student had the first technical delegation from the People's Republic of China, the PRC, came, and they were trying to do a big oil deal, which eventually panned out, and there was a very good joint venture relationship between China and the oil company here. And because I had some martial art training, Chinese, and I spoke some Mandarin at the time, I got invited to go along as an escort. And part of the deal was, "Dennis, you get to demonstrate your fancy Tai Chi and Xingyi." And I did that. And then they had so this was in the morning at lunch, just before lunch. So I did my demonstration. We had lunch. And then all the powers that be had a big meeting. And they had a couple guys who turned out they were the security guys. But I didn't have to go to the meeting. They were kind of free for the afternoon, and they said, "Oh, you like martial arts. Why don't you come with us?" And so I spent the afternoon doing some training with these fellows.
Okay.
I learned Xingyi Quan.
Qingnian,
The
like
one-
youth?
Qingnian.
Yeah.
Youth Fest, yeah.
Right.
Qingnian Quan. So that was kind of fun. So I picked that up, and it turned out they were security guys from the military, and they didn't want to teach me anything too deadly, so they taught me that. But again, they were teaching me, because and I was a pretty quick study. Like I learned Gong Chuan in 1986 from so my teacher's senior student in Xingyi also studied Northern Eagle Claw from Lao Fat Mang.
Okay, which is Lily Lao's father.
Yes.
Yeah.
And my teacher said, "Oh, you should go train with this guy." So they set it up, and I went out to spend a week to train with this fellow. And he said, "Oh, do you want to do Xingyi?" Because he was a Xingyi guy. "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to learn Gong Lei Chuan."
Okay.
Because I was curious, and it's good basic training.
It is.
Right? I think people don't spend enough time on the basics.
Yeah.
And he was kind of surprised. He said, "Well, you've been doing this for 16 years. Why do you want to learn something basic?" I said, "Well, I think it's important."
Basics
So
are
I
everything.
learned. Yeah. And so I learned that form. I arrived Sunday, and by Wednesday I had the form down, and then we spent a couple days doing application. So I was always a quick study for learning the forms.
Okay.
Like I learned Lembu Chuan in under an hour.
Yeah.
I would say 45 minutes,
good.
I mean, it's not perfect, but I can walk through it, and I know enough to correct my mistakes. So I don't want to come across as I'm bragging like I'm some really smart guy.
That's probably also because you had a good basic training with your previous learning that you're able to subsequently learn things.
Oh,
easily,
absolutely.
so.
Yeah, and I always went back to my teacher every year. I would go and visit him up until, like I said, 1988 was the last time I saw him in person. We kept in touch all the time, but it was refinement. So I think people get to a certain, it's like learning a language. You get to a certain level and you're not so concerned about the mistakes because everybody understands you. So, it's that kind of a thing. But so when I came back from the U.S., I met a fellow. He had been an evacuation and detention specialist in Vietnam. And he was an Ishin Ryu and Goju stylist.
Okay.
And he had seen, I was teaching a small group of people, and he'd seen my guys in the tournaments and stuff. And he came over and introduced himself. And we actually became quite good friends. He was best man at my wedding. And he hasn't trained in years because of health issues, but we still keep in regular touch and everything. We ended up getting a contract to train Canadian Armed Forces.
Okay.
Because of my background, because of his background. So I spent about 7 years. Again, I'm doing architecture at the time, so it wasn't like I gave everything up. So this was contract work, but I trained peacekeepers, NATO peacekeepers for deployment during the war in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. I trained military police, VIP protection people, counter ambush and stuff.
Wow.
And I had trained in 95, I spent 6 weeks with the bodyguard instructors unit for the Chinese government in Beijing. They had a base outside of Beijing. It's a closed base. You probably know more about it than I do. They almost shot me the first time I tried to go on the base.
There's one actually pretty close to where I live. I live on the outskirts of northern Beijing, and there's one.
Oh, okay.
There's one pretty close to me here, and of course you don't dare try go in there, but I can hear their trumpets every morning and afternoon and evening. And,
yeah. So this one was on the way to the airport. You would head towards the old airport and then if you're coming out of Beijing, make a right-hand turn, and it was down the road there. But so the first time I went, I was going to train with the Wu Jing.
Right.
And when I got there with my brother-in-law, who was sort of translating and arranging because he had the connections, and a fellow whose father had been chief of staff of the PLA, like he was the former head guy. He'd just retired. And his son, who was our contact, was a colonel. And when I got there, they said, well, you can't go on the base. You're not Chinese. So I thought, okay, good point, obvious. And they said, so my brother-in-law says, oh, Dennis, go stand by that tree there and we'll go and get the commander and then we'll come and get you, right? So I'm standing there and he says to the guy, he said, oh, he's going to wait by the tree, we'll come back and get him. So that's fine. But I'm standing there for a bit and I'm, I have to go to the washroom and I see the washroom, sort of over to the one side. So I start walking towards it and of course there's no real gate. It's kind of like a yellow line on the ground, right? And the guy pulls his pistol out and he goes, and he motions me to go back by the tree, right? So I'm standing there, and this fellow comes by. He was a captain and he looks at the guard and he looks at me and he says, what's that guy doing there? He said, oh, why is this fellow here? He says, I don't know, but he has to stand right beside that tree. So, and even after they came out and they said, we have to go over to the military police depot and get your pass, the guy still wouldn't let me use the washroom.
Oh, no.
So I had to hold it till we got to the...
Well, this is Beijing and you were standing by a tree. So he was probably thinking, there's a tree, use it.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I was going to. It had been a couple more minutes I would have had to. But, so 95 was like the last time we were in China. My wife and I went in 2019, totally as tourists. We just went around and looked at stuff. And I didn't recognize Beijing or Shanghai. It might have been another planet from 95. Yeah, Putong in Shanghai, for example, was just starting to be building. So when I went to the Gong'an school to train there, it was all farmland. Yeah. And in 2019, it was all, high-rise offices all the way to the end, right? I don't even know if the school's there or not.
Yeah, exactly. So my first trip to Beijing was 2001. And already by 2010, it's a completely different place. So.
Oh, yeah, of course. Absolutely. Yeah. Which is good.
Yeah.
I think a lot of like the stuff we like, I'm not sure if there's a big resurgence of martial arts. You can tell me that, like traditional martial arts in China now. I would think it's not, simply because things are going too fast.
Well, not the young generation. They're not interested in any shape or form. Some of the older generation people and, middle-aged people, the older generation people have been practicing irrespective, right? But I would say over the last 5 years, there has been a bit of a resurgence amongst the middle-aged people because there's been a whole nationalistic drive about Chinese cultural practices, particularly martial arts. So some people were, emboldened to get into it. But they're mostly middle-aged people. Young people couldn't give two hoots, really.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
But it's like my teachers. If you knew my teachers, his grandson and I did some martial arts together, but even he didn't keep it up. And he had direct access, to the thing, I think you need a certain mentality. I don't want to say you have to be really serious, but I think you have to be really serious if you want to be good at something.
Yeah.
And And my teacher, because when he was teaching the Tai Chi class sort of for the general public, he was strict. Like he wanted you to learn the correct thing, but he was a little more lenient. But if you were training with him privately, I remember going to class and he wanted me to. We were doing Xingyi actually, and he wanted me to do this move. And, he showed it and I couldn't do it. And he said, well, if you're not going to practice, you shouldn't come for classes anymore. And I'd been with him a few years. So, this was kind of a shock to me. And, I had I was kind of upset. And I had his daughter who translated a lot and said to her, look, just tell your dad, I'd be more than happy to do this move, but he hadn't taught me yet. So he had thought he'd already done this and I hadn't practiced.
Oh, I see.
And and so when she said that, he said, oh, okay. And then he taught it to me. But next time I went, he made sure that I had practiced and that I could do the move. I mean,
Right.
I think that's, first of all, I think it's important that you have people like that. I mean, he wasn't mean. He was never mean. But he was disciplined, and he expected you to be disciplined. Like your teachers like that.
Yeah.
Somebody gave me a set of, not pirated, an actual set. They went out and spent money, but a friend of mine in California sent me a set of your teacher, Xingyi tape, DVDs.
Right.
And I can tell looking at him that he understands my teacher's mentality. And I think your teacher probably has that same kind of he's thinking.
He's very he expects you to practice and don't waste his time. I remember maybe it was about 7 years ago, some group from, I won't name the country, but some Eastern European country came, and they used to come every year. This guy had a school there, and they would come every year for a week or two. And he would bring some students, and they would train, and they would sightsee and whatever. And my teacher doesn't want to tell you that you should be there training when you're there training. He doesn't want to tell you that, right? He expects you to, if you've come to training, train, right? Don't stand around. And even if you stand around and you're not training, most of the time he won't admonish you unless you're very close to him. He'll ignore you.
Yeah.
And if he's ignoring you, you've done something wrong, right? So he's not gonna, but these group had come, and now they've come so far, and we were doing our training, and you get to training, you greet the teacher, and you just get on with it, right? You get on with it, and then he'll intercede and tell you things as he sees as you're going through your training. Maybe he'll tell you, he'll give you some tips on something you're doing, or he'll say, all right, stop that, come over here, and I want to show you something else. But he expects you to be there and just get on with it, right? So these guys were standing around and talking, and my teacher was busy. We were busy training, and he doesn't speak. He speaks Chinese, so
right. No, that's fine.
And these people didn't really. I mean, their teacher who had come understood some rudimentary Chinese, and because he'd come so many times, But my teacher got fed up, and he was just telling me, what are these guys? They fly all the way here, and then they stand around, right? So I just remember him after about a couple of, 2 days or 3 days of this, and then he just walked up to them, and first he asked me, "How do you say lazy in English?" So I told him. So he walks up to them, and he just points at all of them. He says, "You. Lazy, no good." And then he just walked off, So, he doesn't want to spoon feed you because you're supposed to be an adult. He doesn't teach children, specifically because these arts aren't aimed at children. Xingyi and Bagua is not really aimed at children. So he expects you to have a level of discipline and maturity when you come and train with him. And, if he tells you do one line and subconsciously, you should be doing 3. If he tells you to do 3 of something, you should do 5. If he tells you to stand there, don't move until he tells you to stop standing there, And he won't tell you that, but if he sees you doing that, then inside he's got a mental note, and then, okay, he's going to teach you differently to somebody else. So
right. Well, when I started to learn Xingyi, I had been doing Tai Chi for about 6 months, and I was invited because they lived near a huge park in downtown Calgary, and they said, "Oh, come and we'll do Tai Chi in the park." So I go down there, and there's the fellow that was in the class with me he's Chinese, but he's from Canton, Guangzhou. And he was doing something, and I'm watching him, and I said, "Whoa." I said, did Mr. Chang teach you that? He said, no, it's foot gar, which is like, it's an offshoot of Choi Lai Fat.
Yeah.
And he said, no, I learned that when I was a young kid. So he still practiced it, so, and Mr. Chung was doing some Xingyi, and I'm kind of standing there, and I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. So I said, oh, could I learn this, right? And he and his daughter had a conference, and she came back and she said, well, my father's never taught a non-Chinese person. And actually, he never taught outside of the army until he came to Canada and did the Tai Chi class. So she said, if you want to fight, learn how to fight. He won't teach you. And I said, oh, no. I said, I'm interested. I'll learn, whatever he wants to teach me, I'll be happy to learn. So I did Pichuan up and down this concrete pad, which was probably 50, 60 feet long. Up and down, 4 or 5 times, because I'd see them like 4 or 5 times a week, up and down for about 3 weeks. And I just did it. He showed it to me and he said, okay, go practice. And I just went and practiced. And after about 3 weeks, he said, okay, you're serious enough. I'll teach you. Right. And that's how I started learning Xingyi. And it was hard work.
Yeah.
As you know.
Yeah.
So,
would you say Xingyi was one of your teacher's preferred practices?
Yes, I would say that's his main practice.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting because we kind of think, and I'm sure this was your teacher's mentality as well, coming to the West, because of the structure, the layout, the method of practice, and then the direct, simple efficacy of the art, that teaching that in the West is not something people would be interested in,
No.
And that's probably why he focused. He focused on Tai Chi, and we find that that's pretty common. And I think it's there is something to that with regards to the unfortunate understanding of what Chinese martial art practice is in the West. So it's a pity because teaching Xingyi obviously was probably something he would have enjoyed doing more, and it's, as you said, his main practice. So that's probably why he didn't even think you'd want to learn it, or others wouldn't want to learn it.
Yeah, and the thing you have to remember, in the mid 70s or the early 70s, most of the Chinese people, either born here or immigrants, they were either first or second generation from Hong Kong and southern China. There was not a lot of first of all, Taiwanese, and secondly, certainly not people originally from the mainland. There were a few, but they were much older. And so everybody knew what Tai Chi was, but nobody knew what Xingyi was. So, it's kind of, if you advertised it, people would say, oh, is that, it's like cooking class or, something. I don't know. I sort of knew what it was, but I liked what he was doing. I'd done a little bit of martial arts before I started university. I got dragged into a jiu-jitsu class that a girl that was interested in me signed us up for without telling me. And she said, what are you doing Tuesday night? I said, nothing, good, because you're going to this jiu-jitsu class. And the fellow that taught it was Dutch. He was a student of Anton Giesing.
Okay.
And he was about my size, but he could handle big guys.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's kind of interesting, but not really my cup of tea. And I did a little karate in high school, but the club that I had signed up for, the green belts like to punch the beginners in the nose.
Oh, very nice.
When we were learning our blocks. So I lasted about 2 months, and I said, well, this is going nowhere. I'm not learning anything. I know what my blood looks like, but that's about it. And so when this came along, I thought, I'm going to try that. And as it, it's I don't know the Mandarin word, yunfan.
Oh,
in
Yuan
Cantonese. Yunfan.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I was serious enough, and I found a good teacher, and I stayed with him.
Very good.
Yeah. And I think that's important. I mean, one of the things is there's not that many good teachers, but by the same token, and I don't want to make us out like we're superstars. Maybe you are, I'm not, but
no, I'm definitely
there's not good students. It's very difficult to find good students.
Well, that's a saying, right? My teacher would say the same thing. Finding a good teacher is hard, but finding a good student is even harder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, like, my wife takes Gujiang from a teacher originally from Hong Kong, but her teacher is like a national Gujiang player.
Right.
Like, she's recognized nationally in mainland China as one of the top Gujiang players. So, so my wife's serious. And she's serious to learn, and her teacher's serious to teach. So they have a good melding of kind of not only sort of physical attributes, but also sort of the same kind of mental path, right?
Right.
So there we go.
Right.
But we were talking about training the military.
Right, we were.
I think we got. So I had already been to Taiwan in the late 70s, and I trained with their special forces people, reconnaissance. So I already had sort of a military kind of, I was interested in the martial arts. I didn't do all the training they had, but, I got some nice badges, and, they wouldn't give me an honorary rank. They said it's against the military regulations to give out honorary ranks. But they, the special forces guys gave me something, the fourth group, and the amphibious reconnaissance guys gave me their badges. And Chang Xiang Wu, I received the Chang Xiang Wu Award for culture.
Okay.
From the president, Chiang Kai-shek's son, who was president at the time. That was around 1980. And then in 82, they gave me people might not know this, but so Taiwan doesn't have an embassy in the United States. It's the Coordination Council at that time, and then it has another thing because of the politics. Right. But they gave me special recognition as a martial art instructor. That was in 1982.
Wow.
So they recognized my teacher and my Tai Chi and Xingyi training. So when my friend who had been in Vietnam said, "You want to go and do some work with the military?" I said, "Sure, let's go do that." So I spent 7 years doing contract work. Wow. And I was teaching. I mean, we did everything. I trained the field bodyguards for General Cox, who was the NATO operation commander in the former Yugoslavia. And I have a picture of them. They're literally over a foot taller than I am. Like, these guys are like 6'9".
Oh, wow.
They're huge. Yeah, they're huge. And I'm standing there with my arms crossed, looking so content. And it was funny because we had to do some rifle and bayonet training for whatever reason. That's part of their training. And they said, "Well, you learned this, can you show us some stuff?" So I took these two guys and I beat them pretty good with the puffy sticks. And they took me aside afterwards, because everybody gave me a big round of applause, right? And they took me aside and they said, "You got to tone it down a little bit." He says, "We're the rifle and bayonet instructors for the company, and you made us look really bad." So I gave him a book, a manual. I said, "Here, go learn this stuff."
Was this before you published your translation of Huang Bonians' book?
Yes.
So that's pretty interesting. So all of these things are just a natural process out of the events of your life. I mean, even the publication of this book.
Yeah, that was kind of a last sort of, and I wish I had the pictures of my teacher in military uniform and stuff. Oh. So let me just back up for 1 second. So the material. So I learned short staff, which is basically the rifle and bayonet, and I learned that saber, two-hand saber, which in the military school was like a Western style saber.
Yeah.
People try and say, "Oh, it was a Maldo," but it wasn't. It was a Western style. But they taught that. So when I found Huang Bonians' book, and I took it to my teacher, I said, "Oh, look at this." He said, "Oh yeah, I know that guy." And it was the same, very similar to what I had already learned.
Yeah.
So when I decided after my teacher passed away, I thought, well, this should be something I can do sort of for him, because he was a Xingyi guy, B, he knew Huang, and C, he was a military guy. So it kind of tied everything together.
Yeah. And
I still get, $50-$60 a year in royalties from them, and that's, 14 years later. So.
Well, I hope that because it's now what it's getting close to 15 odd years since the book was initially published. So maybe it's maybe not in the current mentality or in the eyesight of practitioners today, because of course there's hundreds of people that surely have picked up the art in the last 5 years. So hopefully those that are listening to this will be interested and pick up the book, because it's definitely worth reading. I think it's a nicely put together book, both from its content and what you can learn from it, but also as a historical reference for the arts, and to see their placing of Xingyi Quan, which people seem to not really understand in the West. Xingyi Quan was an extremely prominent art, particularly in mainland China and the north, coming out of the imperial era into the republican era. It was an extremely prominent martial art at the end of the Qing dynasty in terms of other avenues as well, but you rarely hear about it because Tai Chi was pushed so heavily, both domestically here and then internationally in the last 50 years. So
right. Yeah. And I think the other thing people forget is Xingyi is a combat art.
Yeah.
You can do it for exercise, but it was designed for combat art. It's like when I was training in China, the Sanda from the military.
Yeah.
They're teaching you to hit guys. They're not teaching you to, to
look good.
Look good. Yeah. So and people forget that, people think, oh yes, I do. I had a couple of guys come who had trained in Taiwan, their teacher had trained in Taiwan with someone who's very well known. I won't mention the name. And they came to see me and they were doing, we're Tai Chi, Xingyi guys, and we're really good and blah, 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 kind of. And they were doing sort of what I would call the beginner level training. So you would do like Pichuan. You would do the reinforcing step. They would bring up the back foot and they would stomp it on the ground.
No.
Okay, well, the way I was told about that is these are people who forget to move their foot. So the beginner, and that's the way to remind them. But once you learn how to do that, you can't do that movement and do Pichuan correctly.
Right.
It's just to kind of get things going. And I said to them, well, okay, how long have you been doing this? And the guy said, 4 or 5 years. And I said, but that's a beginner's move. No, it's not. Our teacher still does that. That's how he teaches and that's how he performs. And I said, okay, fine. But, let's go outside where the grass is kind of wet. And, let's see how you move around on there. Not so good. And, that's the other thing. People are very good. Like I have a friend who does Aikido, and they're very good on a mat. But if you get them out sort of in knee-high grass or something, you can't do much.
Right.
Because it's made for that sort of flat surface, right?
Yeah.
So the combat art quickly degenerates.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the benefits of how we practice here in mainland China is we train outside wherever, however, in all weather. So you kind of get used to, for example, when it snows here in winter, and then as things start to warm up going into the end of winter and the snow melts, it just becomes ice. So there's been many times I've been training with my teacher and there's just ice patches on the floor and they're all over the place. And it really, you just keep training, but you have to make sure that everything is suitable, and it really advances your training as you're doing it on different terrains in different seasons. So that's
right. I used to work on occasion in Venice Beach. We had my joint venture partner. They had a architecture studio, a block from the beach, and in the morning I'd go out after they had plowed up and cleaned all the sand, and I'd go and do Tai Chi, and the sand's quite loose, and you learn really quickly, you turn your ankle the wrong way, you're going to get hurt.
Yeah.
You don't lift your foot properly. You're going to, it teaches you. But, if you go back to the origin of these art, they were not fighting, on mats.
Yeah.
And I don't mean in terms of MMA or anything like that. I'm not talking about that, but I'm saying they're not, polished floors. They're not doing that. They're out in the mud and they're out in which is why I like training the military guys. We did a course they were reconnaissance instructors for the Army, and we spent 2 weeks with them. And we would come in at 7:30 in the morning, and they had already done their run for the day. And then we started, and it was winter, and we got a lot of snow in Calgary.
Yeah.
It's right near the Rocky Mountains, so, minus 40 is not uncommon. And the first thing we always taught was knife fighting and defense. So edge weapon training, right? So because if you're down to that, you're in serious trouble. So, you have to kind of move up from there. And we would take them outside in the snow in their combat boots, but they weren't allowed to wear jackets. They were, in their things. And we would train them like that. And they learned really, really quickly what you need to pay attention to because you get hurt.
Yeah.
And it's not getting stabbed. It's, slipping on the ice, like you were saying, and falling down and, injuring yourself. So I think that's kind of my sort of mentality towards all that, partially from my teachers, partially from the other opportunities I've had. But I think as martial artists, if you want to be a martial artist, you really have to train to be a martial artist in terms of use, in terms of environment, in terms of, preparedness, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Well, you probably know more than I do.
I will say this. I mean, before I started training with my teacher, I'd always trained indoors in a martial arts school. And I do remember my initial, it must be subconscious, but that it's there when I first started training with my teacher. And if the weather wasn't perfect or the floor wasn't ideal, and subconsciously you'd want to say, oh, well, this is no good. We can't really train today, and
right.
My teacher wouldn't even say anything. So I would just continue training. And eventually you realize, no, that is part of the training. That's part of the training.
Yes, exactly.
So you just got to get on with it, because it really is it's a allegory kind of, comparison for life. You can't be a fair weather liver, so you can't be a fair weather trainer. You can't simply train when things are going well and then put it off when things are going bad. Just like you can't do things in your daily life only when the conditions are perfect, because they're rarely ever going to be perfect. So you got to learn how to build up that resilience through whatever happens.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, I'm preaching to the converted. I don't, wow, that was a very short interview. You didn't really tell us anything.
Well, I did want to get into the book a little bit, if we could, maybe you want to introduce some aspects of the book that you wrote, its background, what you did with it, etc.
Okay, so I had done, prior to Blue Snake Books, I had done a preliminary version that I kind of sold to people that I knew, and some people that were interested bought it. And the translation was good, but it wasn't really what I wanted it to be.
Okay.
And I was on one of the forums, and somebody who had worked with Blue Snake Books saw this and said, would you be interested in redoing the book? And because I was talking about it, I said, yeah, it's okay, but it's not really what I want. I want to show more application. I want to because so I'm taking the translation and Huang's writing, and I'm trying to tie it into what was done at the Central Military Academy. So that was the overall idea. So of course, you're going to have to show some applications and things like that. So somebody saw this and said, oh, I know the guys there. I used to be an editor for them, and I'm having lunch with the head guy. And he said, I'll mention your name. And 2 days later, I get this guy sends me an email and says, hi, we'd like you to do this book. We're sending you a contract, but you have 6 months to do it. Can you meet the deadline? So I went ahead and said, sure. I signed it. There was a couple things that I didn't like about the contract that Brian Kennedy and I discussed
Okay.
And he was the late, people must know him. He's a famous translator, he and his wife.
Yeah.
He's passed away, which is too bad, but he was a great friend to me. He supplied me with information anytime I asked it, and just a wonderful person. So he had some information that I could use, and I had notes because I'm kind of an archivist. I think it's my background in archaeology and academia, and I had copious notes from my teacher, and I said, okay, fine, I'm going to do it. So what I did is I did the translation, I reposed the photos, and I had Huang Bonians' book has never had good photos in it.
Well, it's from that period of time, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I went in and I used Photoshop, and I filled in where the sword should be in some of them, and the other thing about Wang's book is he talks about, so the rifle and bayonet section, he talks about the application, but he doesn't demonstrate it. So I thought, well, I'm going to demonstrate it. I'll show these people, people how they work and what he's talking about, and some of the sort of the nuances of how you hold the rifle and how you use the wrist to maximize your leverage against the opponent's weapon and things like that. So I wanted to do the same thing for the saber section, but I didn't have enough time, and people have complained. So I have some applications, but I have all of what Huang was talking about and the kinds of things my teacher would have taught me. But I wanted to show, again, more applications. So I might do a book with just the saber applications.
Well,
from the military,
I'm sure you could speak
point
to,
of view.
Blue Snake and see if you do an updated, revised version of the whole book and just add that in. I mean, if you're up to it.
Never thought of that.
So I mean that could be a nice little thing to do, and then
sure.
And then of course the existing content that you're happy with is all valuable. So then it's been a good number of years. There's not going to be an overlap there in terms of I just bought this book,
not at
so
all.
it's 20 years odd. It's a perfect time to do it.
Right, and now I have the military academy pictures,
right.
And I have pictures of my teacher in the field. So I mean that would make it much better.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I did do, which I'll send you a copy, I did a DVD of the applications of the rifle and bayonet.
Okay.
And people from time to time send me emails and said, are you going to do an application for the saber? And I said, well, like a DVD. And I said, well, I haven't really given it much thought because I've been busy. But sure,
that's
sometime.
Good.
So I have a 5-year goal to get all my writing out of the way, and then I'm going to stop talking to people completely.
Well, I think this is good. I think this is something really to look forward to.
Yeah, but so what I was trying to do was kind of take this historical thing and say, look, it's not just an old book. It actually had value. It was taught. It was used by the military.
Yeah.
And here's some more information. So that's kind of that was my approach. And, if you go on the back of the book, you can see where my teacher fits in the lineage of the people now it's not a complete lineage, but it's all of sort of his direct connections.
Yes. I see it here.
And I think that's important too, because as I found out years later, he was actually a very, very well-respected martial arts teacher among the military. So, and we're talking like chief of staff of the army and stuff. So there's a picture in that book of my teacher with a scroll behind him.
Yeah. It's in the front.
It's an essay by Yang Fu.
Yeah.
I think it's Yang Fu. That was given to him by I believe he was the chief of staff of the military, of the army.
Okay.
And he signs it at the bottom, even though he's like, 3-star general, 2-star, whatever he was. He signs it as you would, the symbol for up. You put it next to your, the signature.
Yeah.
It means I hand it up to you.
Right.
So even though he outranked my teacher, he used the sort of the honorific presentation thing to give to him.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I'm looking at the picture right now.
There you go.
Yeah.
So, and that's another thing that that I see a lot. I went the first tournament I went to support a friend of mine who runs a club, but he only teaches little kids.
Okay.
And he just does it for fun. He's an engineer. And he said, "Oh, we're going to this tournament. You want to go?" And I said, "Oh, I haven't been to a tournament in 28 years or 25 years." And I went, and I thought, "Okay, I'm good for another 25 years," because people have all these sort of rituals, but they really don't understand sort of the context of that.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, we bow and we do all this and we give Buddha salutes and all this stuff. But I look at it and I guess it's a little contrived.
Yeah.
To me. And it is that way, not because they're being disrespectful. I think they're trying to be respectful, but they really don't have a sort of cultural context.
Right.
And, somebody like you or I look at it, or, some of my friends who are Chinese scholars would say, kind of shake their head and walk away. I mean, they're all polite people, but, they look at it and it's like, oh, what are they doing?
Right.
I don't understand that. And I think, I think that's an important element, not from the point of view as we're trying to, keep dead sort of traditions and live in the Middle Ages. I'm not saying that, but I think it's important in terms of a greater understanding, maybe a better appreciation, better, more respect for.
Well, I think that's
those kinds of things.
One of the other, we practice the martial arts. Specifically, we're doing what we'd consider classical Chinese martial arts, is also because we're trying to learn about the culture of the place that they came from and the cultures contained within those arts. I think that's a very interesting and valuable part of practice. So, to that end, you'd want to learn those aspects as correctly and as deeply as possible, because that's what gives value and meaning to it. So,
right.
I know there's a lot of teachers that don't have that, but they're teaching, the techniques as best as they can, but they're missing that other whole half of it.
Yeah. So. And that might not be their fault. That might be their teacher's fault, or.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times you can't fault the people that are learning, but you can fault the teacher in terms of not presenting sort of the big picture, the whole picture.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Yeah.
But I was lucky in terms of Chinese culture. So my Chinese, I was doing the oracle bone and Chinese bronze seminars. And my professor was from Hong Kong, and he was, at the time, he and the fellow he studied under was considered the best oracle bone translator in the industry. And my teacher was considered the second best because he was the student. But he did calligraphy. He was a seal carver. He came from a very wealthy family, so he didn't really, he was well educated, but he didn't have to make a living. Okay. So he wasn't a professor to make money. He was a professor because he loved teaching. So I was kind of introduced to all of that culture. So I had a bigger picture cultural experience, I think. And then my first Mandarin teacher was from Beijing. He was an older gentleman. His grandfather had been minister to the Dowager Empress, and he was governor, I think, of 3 provinces. And there's a very funny story about him, because he and I did Tai Chi together. That's how I met him. And I was in my 20s, and he was in, probably late 50s or whatever. And he said he was invited when he was like 3 years old or 4 years old to go to the Forbidden City. This is before Puyi was kicked out, to learn martial arts, and from the military martial art instructor. And he said the first time he was there, they had the big courtyard, and I actually have a photo of the training area in the Forbidden City. You've probably been there too. And he had to run around this big area, this little kid, and he comes back and he's sweating and everything. And he said, teacher, he says, what does this have to do with martial arts? Like, like with protecting myself. And he says, well, I haven't taught you how to fight, so you should learn how to run. and that was his introduction to martial arts.
Very true, though.
But again, but a very cultured gentleman. His two sons were doctors, and his wife was just a lovely lady. And so I had this kind of exposure, which I'm very fortunate. I think about them often. They're all passed away, but I think about them and I think, I was pretty lucky. Here's an Italian guy living in Calgary, and I get all of these kind of opportunities. So,
well, that's great.
Anyhow,
that's great.
Yeah.
One thing that stuck out to me in this book, the original, which you translated, Huang Bonians' book, the forewords were by, there were some big names there. I mean, Sun Lutang, you had Jiang Rongqiao. Jiang Rongqiao was actually posing in the photos as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So, it's a meaningful, in terms of historical document as well, there's a lot of value to it too, and it's, for me, that Republican era is really interesting because it was kind of, China was trying to step forward into, the modern times. And while at the same time, they were trying to hold on to their identity. And this is really important with regards to the people and the practices that they try to bring into a national movement, which, I mean, that was basically...
Oh, absolutely.
What it was.
Yeah.
And the people also don't realize there was a lot of influence from what was happening around them, particularly with what the Japanese were doing with regards to their modernization. And they managed to successfully, at least the Japanese managed to successfully take aspects of their older arts and put it into a national modernizing kind of framework. And China was trying to do that. And for me, the tragedy of the Guoshu movement and that period is that it was cut short. So it was cut short by the Civil War and the invasion first by Japan and then the Civil War.
The invasion, yeah.
And that kind of, we don't know what would have, in my opinion, had that not happened, but the Guoshu movement had continued to develop unhindered from that period, I'm pretty sure we would have had a so-called MMA event come out of China way before anybody else was actually trying to think of something in a formalized context like that, because it had started there. It had started there. And it's a very interesting period.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I think people miss is I wrote an article that was published in the journal. I can't. I think it was Mamingda and Journal of Chinese Martial Arts or something. I had published
the Journal of Asian.
No,
Asian, that one that Henning also used to feature in.
No, it's. Let me see if I can find it. I don't want to take too much time.
No problem.
It was. Oh my goodness. Okay, I can't remember it, but I think it was the Journal of Chinese Martial Arts.
Okay.
It was.
Is it published out of Hong Kong?
It was.
Okay.
And it only lasted like 4 or 5.
Yeah, I know it. I'm very.
Anyhow, I did a thing about.
Hing Chao was one of the main people that was pushing that, along with the Ma family.
Yeah, Wang Yunming. Wang Yunming, I think, was the other guy.
Exactly. They were all involved there.
So I did an article in there, and I talked about esoteric writings in Xingyi and problems with translation, because one of the things that because of my PhD background in kinesiology, and my engineering and architecture, of course, background, is I look at when I read these things, I look at them in terms of modeling. What are the Chinese writers modeling? And so if you look at some of the Tai Chi writings, for example, and my mind, because I'm old, my mind might go, but they call like cutting force. And I'm doing actually an article on Tai Chi and health and how to improve it in health research. And they have say the concept of cutting force in Tai Chi, if you look at that and you read what they're talking about, it actually translates over to overturning moment, torque, those kinds of things. So you have Western sorts of models that fit, like they don't. So I think they were talking about similar concepts to what I would as an engineer, an architect, a biomechanicist, any of those kinds of things. But the models are different. So when I look at the old writings, I look at them more from a how to improve the movement kind of a thing. So it's not just, it's interesting and we're trying to be progressive and this and that, but there's actually a lot of really key information that we forget.
Right.
Or we overlook, or we don't understand.
Yeah. Which in terms of writings that you're referring to, like which are there any specific writings from which period that you're referring to here?
Yeah. So in the 20s, there was in the classics of Tai Chi, there's like the 35 types of force.
Okay.
For example, I'm on my computer here, and I'm going to see if I can find it.
Go for it.
But so there's these type. So here, I'll give you a quote, a translation. Maybe I won't give you a translation. Just a second here. I mean, I don't want to take up time.
No. These podcasts go for as long as they need to go. So.
Okay. So one of the movements in Tai Chi, the Yang Cheng Fu talks about. Pushing against the ground and the resistance. So the force comes from the foot through the body, and out the end of the hand, right? Well, in kinesiology and biomechanics, there's an actual term for that, and you use it to analyze the components of force.
Okay.
So I'm looking at that and I'm saying, oh yeah, this is pretty interesting stuff. But I'm looking at it not from a translator trying to, go word for word. I'm looking at it from a sort of a conceptual translation. How does this fit?
Right.
What does
it mean? What does it mean in practical terms?
Exactly. What does it mean, and how can it be used?
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the biggest thing that I get out of the old writings, as opposed to, I look at the picture and, the guy has his foot this way, but that could be, well, we don't do it that way. So, we must be wrong, or he must be wrong, but it could be the guy took the photo at the wrong time.
But also you find that, and this is what people don't get, the guy drawing the pictures was not the same person that was explaining the things. That's a lot of the time what happened with regards to ones with like picture drawings from the last 150 years.
Right.
And the second thing is, a lot of the time the teacher explaining things was illiterate. So there was a person who was writing, right? And sometimes they used the wrong character because of accent differences or misunderstanding. So if you add sometimes the writing error, and then you've also got a drawing error, and then you've got people that are just trying to copy a drawing today and say, look at his wrist, or look at this, or look at that. And you're like, you shouldn't be paying so much attention to that drawing or the photo, because photos were so expensive then in any case. So if they screwed one up, they were very rarely going to say, well, let's shoot that again. They'll be like, it's good enough, so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so...
And then if you have, like in Huang's book, you have the little white dotted...
lines.
Overlay pieces, that...
Yeah.
If you can learn from that, you're a better man than me. But, prime example of that is my wife was the main translator for the book.
Yeah.
I badgered her for months, and, but one of the things... Because she translates and then we discuss it, because I know the martial art. My Chinese is nowhere as good as hers, especially her father taught classical Chinese literature and history. So she had kind of a heads up on me by a long shot. But the thing that one time we were doing this section, and I said, She said, this is the translation, but I don't know what it means. And so she read it to me, and I said, oh, this is what it is, da, 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 da. And she said, oh, good, I'm glad you know, because, I can't make heads or tails of it. The other thing that people forget is a lot of material in those days was hidden. So they would use, like single whip squatting or, Swan.
Yeah.
In Xingyi. I say that, what's that? Well, they would use these sort of sometimes very esoteric names simply to disguise the fact that, or keep the movement or the understanding of the movement away from someone who wasn't from their club or their school, and you might have to fight them in the alley after closing hours or whatever they were doing. So that's another thing. So they're using terms, and people, they may be a name, it may be a literal, but typically they're couched in sort of, they're disguised to keep the knowledge hidden.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I found that because for the last 7 years I've been working on a translation of the classics, and it's ready now. I'm going to publish it at some point this year. But
oh, good.
And it's become
put me on the list.
Oh, great! I definitely will. It's been a long thing, absolutely. So it's not just the translation, because you'll find a lot of literal translations out there by translators, but they're missing points, right? So I didn't focus on a literal translation per se, but rather what are they trying to mean, and then I've got commentary underneath it that explains what they're trying to say. And and it's just grown over the years. It's now sitting close to 400 pages. But I think that's what I'm going to do. That's it. I'm not going to add any more to it for now. And it's been, I think.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, it's over the years with my teacher teaching me and telling me you've got to understand these classics, and then explaining while you're learning what the classics mean, right? So it's not simply just reading the classics, because that's what these manuals were. They weren't for people to learn from. They were for people that were learning to refer to. And in some cases, they were a person's own literal, what can you say, enlightenment at a certain point. It's like, aha, after 8 years of training, he's understood this and this, and he writes that down. But that little piece of enlightenment means nothing if you don't understand everything before it. So, it's a combination of these aspects. So,
yeah. And the other thing is, I like to read Bill. Do you know Bill Porter?
Yes,
He's
I do.
Buddhist.
Red Pine.
Okay.
I've got all his books.
He does very nice. Oh, do you?
Yeah, I've got all.
Then I'm not going to tell you anything new, but you notice how he puts in explanatory notes.
Yes, exactly.
With his poetry book especially, and the thing is, you can read it on one level, but as soon as you look at that, it's like, oh, he's talking about, the Western Gate and all those kinds of things that people without a really, really good understanding of the culture don't get.
Yeah, they won't get
No,
it.
not at all. So, yeah, okay, fine. We got a bunch of stuff, but we also lost a bunch of stuff because we really don't know what the context is, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's an example as well. Like older names for Shandong and Shanxi were Shanzuo and Shanyo, which means mountain left and mountain right. I don't know if you know these terms, but
yes,
from a Western perspective, you'd immediately think Shanzuo, mountain left, is east, and Shanyo is west. Yes. But that's not how the cardinal points were put in classical Chinese thought. It was ahead, or north was always down, and south was not in terms of our south. It was just up and down, left and right. Up was always down, south in our layout. So left would actually be east, and right would be west. And sometimes you find these aspects in martial art writing from earlier periods. But you wouldn't know what they're talking about with left and right in terms of direction, because you have to know that context of how they used to, place directions in classical writing. So, there's a lot of that. And then, of course, if somebody's just a translator, he's going to miss all of that. So.
Yeah, and some translations I've seen, there's a fellow that does a lot of translation.
Yeah.
And puts it out for free, which is good on the one level, but if you look at the Chinese, he actually misses things.
I've seen it. I know who you're talking about, but yes, for sure, there's misunderstandings and things missed.
Yeah. So as a practitioner, I look at that and I say, well, that's not actually, you're missing two sentences, or you're missing sort of the key point.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes a problem because non-Chinese my Chinese is degenerated.
Yeah.
I wouldn't claim to be a Chinese speaker expert. I mean, I can get by, but I use it once every 20 years. My Italian's still pretty good because I still read architecture in Italian, but my Chinese, not very good, probably never was very good. My pronunciation's okay, but the rest of it's pretty bad. So I defer to you and your colleagues as the experts in Chinese language, right? Oh, so sijin, which is cutting.
Right.
Force. I found my example. So so they talk about cutting force, and if you read the translation or the explanation of cutting force, it's so in engineering, cutting is a shearing action, right? Okay. So that's sudden failure, like you break a beam, it just one plane slides besides the other. Yes. So that's shearing. So, but they call sijin is cutting. Excuse me. But if you look at the explanation, what they're actually talking about is torque. So you're applying a force perpendicular that causes rotation.
Okay.
So this is what one of the things I'm interested in is what are they really saying, and if we can translate it, then and relate it to a model in sort of Western thinking, then it becomes more valuable for practitioners. They can look at that and say, oh, okay, what he's really saying is you're causing a rotation. So that's kind of a pet project that I'm doing.
Well, that's great. And you've been working on an article. Is this just an article, or is it going to be a book? Or
I just had a couple not martial art articles. I'm doing two right now. One is a health, because of my PhD work was I looked at Eastern approaches to movement in cardiac rehabilitation, stage 1 cardiac rehab. So that's what my area was. And I've lectured on sort of Tai Chi and those kinds of things, and how we can adapt it. Plus my background working for Health and Welfare Canada. So I had sort of a grounding in that. So I can use real life examples, which makes it easier to explain to students.
Yeah.
But so that's an article I'm working on. But that's sort of healthcare, that aspect. And I'm going to do one for a Journal of Chinese Military History. I'm going to talk about Tao Lu.
Okay.
The form practice in the context of Mrs. Chang, Major Chang's teaching at Changsha, and how that sort of martial arts, not only teaching self-defense to the militia and to the commandos, Yuji Doi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
So, and how that relates sort of on a psychological, physical, cultural level, historical level. And if you understand what was going on during that time period and Chiang Kai-shek rallying the troops for fighting the Japanese and stuff, I think there's a lot more going on than theater and dance. So
let's not open that can of worms again.
No, let's not. Let's stay away from that. I'm sorry I said that. You can edit that one out.
It's okay.
But I'm saying there's so much going on there that gets missed.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'm interested in is, so there was a book written, I think, in 1926 on Lien Buchuan.
Okay.
Lien Buchuan.
Yeah.
And my teacher, Mrs. Chung, taught that in the military, and I learned it the way they taught it in the Army. And it's different than how sort of the classical kinds of movement are, because they've taken this traditional form and they said, look, that's nice if the guy's in a nice outfit or sweatpants or whatever, but they're going to be carrying gear.
Yeah.
They're going to have weapons. They're going to have backpacks. And a lot of this stuff doesn't work or isn't as if I shouldn't say doesn't work, isn't as efficient if you do sort of the classical version. So they took it and they modified it for the military to actually use in combat with their stuff.
Yes.
So, and the simplest example I can give you is if you look at the opening move, grasp the ball or whatever they call it, depending on who you talk to. If you look at the classical version from the 1926, the elbows and arms are parallel to each other, and then there's a space in between where the ball is supposed to be held. Okay. In the military version, the top elbow is down and the right elbow is up a bit. And the reason for that is because if somebody charges you, like say they want to, knock you over in a football or a rugby kind of tackle, or if they're shooting the legs like in MMA, this actually applies pressure to the brachial plexus and to the collarbone. And then what happens, the second move is you drop into Mabu and you lift the hands. Well, that's a neck breaking technique.
I see. So basically, I mean, I do a lot of wrestling and grappling as well. And that's exactly the action that I naturally go to, is a dropping of my forearm to block the collarbone of the opponent as he drives in. Yeah. Dropping the waist so he doesn't get under you, and then cranking the neck. Yeah. That's exactly it. Yeah. I mean, I did it yesterday morning to somebody. So they teach it,
and because... Oh, there you go. See, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So if the opponent's wearing a helmet and you do that, you can't kind of gently lead them to the ground. Yeah. Or back up and bring them down. What you're trying to do is, because it's war, right? You grab them by the helmet, grab him, and then the helmet restricts his head movement, and he's done for.
Yeah, very interesting.
So that's what I'm saying. So they're taking, what we would say is classical styles, and they're saying, look, we need to actually use this. It looks nicer this way, but it's not as effective. Yeah. Well, Sanda in the military is the same thing, right? Yeah. They strip everything down, excuse me, and they do very basic, movements that you can do under stress. Yeah. Movements that you can do if you haven't been sleeping or, taken by surprise. I mean, that's the whole point of the military training. Right. Yeah. And that goes back to this is the form and this is the application. So, I've kind of, in 50 years, I've kind of gone full circle back to
the beginning,
to where I am.
Well, that's great.
Yeah, but I'm going back with a different attitude. I'm trying to be more polite to people, and I bite my tongue a lot more. My tongue's been very sore in the last.
Well, I'm guilty. I'm guilty of the same thing in my younger days, being a lot more loose-lipped and unsympathetic when I would explain or address somebody about one of these things. And I guess that's just the natural part of youth, and we learn to conduct ourselves in a different way as we get older, but that's normal.
Yeah, of course. So those are the kinds of things I still fiddle with, and I still do some and now that in theory I have more time. Lately it hasn't been that way, but I'm trying to do more of the kinds of things like historical research, things that I'm interested in, or the stuff I talked to you about, biomechanics and that kind of stuff, that because it keeps my mind going, and it's stuff that I still like. And I think we should do more things that we like as opposed to things we have to do.
I agree. So, well, I'm looking forward to whatever you produce, and I hope that you'll be updating and releasing a revised, expanded edition of the Xingyi Quan of the Chinese Army. So,
if not, it'll be volume 2 or something.
Or even.
The other thing I was going to tell you, I don't know how much time
you have as much time as you need.
Okay. So I learned a sword form, which from my teacher and it was a form they taught in the military school that, I said, I want to learn Tai Chi sword, but he taught me this form instead. Okay. And it's a Xingyi based form that they actually used with the saber. And I thought that I still practice that because I thought it was kind of interesting. This is something, and I've never seen anybody else do
It'll
it.
be interesting to see
So
it.
I might re-record it. I have an old recording of me doing it, and it's very sort of it's very sort of Xingyi-ish, I would say. But they also have like a similar move that they would do at Bagua, where you circle around.
Yeah,
if the guy attacks in a straight line, you do a circle and then you cut across the weapon hand or whatever. Yeah, so that's something that I learned along the way from him, and it's simple. But again, this is the move, this is the cut, this is the block, this is the counter, that kind of thing. It's always a one-to-one relationship.
Right.
So
when your teacher was teaching you Xingyi Quan, I mean, was there any underlying idea with regards to, for example, 5-element? So the 5 elements and their underlying core and, we could say origin, but their essential function, and then expanding 12 animals and what theirs are. I mean, was there any... Well, how do you see it? Let me rather put it that way as opposed to your teacher.
Oh, okay. So he taught me all the names and he wrote them down and they translated them, and so we did the 5 basic punches.
Yeah.
We did the linking form. We did 12 animals. It's interesting. We did water strider.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys do water
strider. We call
strider.
it tuo.
You do,
tuo, we do it. We don't.
Tuo.
We consider it not an insect. We consider it a mythical, one of the dragon's 9 sons, the one with a turtle shell.
Okay, so this is a vertical block, say with the left hand, and then a straight thrust with the right hand.
Yeah.
On a diagonal
trajectory.
Step. Yeah. So Chu Guofu, one of Chu Guofu's second generation from Chu Guofu, I have his BCD.
Okay.
And he's the first guy I've seen that did Xingyi that actually did that move. So that's interesting that your teacher does that. I'll have to go and take a good look at what he's doing.
And the thing about those DVDs are that he presents very little of the deeper, and a good example is I've been recording instructional stuff for example, the 5 elements. His DVD on the 5 elements is very fundamental and rudimentary. It's an hour, the DVD, and in it you've done all 5 elements plus the linking form.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I can teach you the first 2 movements of the linking form, and it'll take me an hour of explanation just on that. So
I was going to say.
So
okay.
You're not going to get too much depth looking at that. I would suggest rather look a little bit more at his writing, his books on it, because there's a little bit more detail there. So, yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So we learned the 5 elements, or the 5 fists, the linking form, the 12 animals, and then we learned a linking form for the 12 animals. Yes. And the Anshan Pao, the 2-man forms, a couple of them. Yeah. So in terms of theory, I would say less theory, more practice.
Yeah.
And, I think because of the language barrier, for one thing, he's not going to be able to explain a whole bunch of stuff, and anybody translating it for me, like his children, are not going to be able to explain it to me. So I've kind of had to poke around on that. But so just so we know, in the military school, they only taught the 5 fists in the linking form.
Okay.
That's all. And when I asked him about that, he said, well, they didn't have much time, So he said, your training's different because we've got to do a whole bunch of more stuff than they would have opportunity. Plus, they had to train weapons, and they had a very short period of time to do all that.
I think those are connected ideas. That's my own, my own understanding as it is today through my experience. I don't know. I'll just let you know what I'm getting at here. For me, the body mechanics and the vectors of force that are developed with the core 5 elements are directly applicable as is to weapons.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
I wrote it. I actually had an article. Sorry, I didn't.
No,
no.
Go ahead. Yeah, you had an article on this.
I published an article years ago on sort of I called it uniform method of training. And because I was doing work with the military at the time, so empty hand and Xingyi, rifle and bayonet, saber, handgun. You'll look at the basic stances, the basic movements. They're all connected. So it's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. So for me, I can understand why not teaching the 12 animals to the military would have happened, because the 12 animals are more akin to practical bare-hand use. And in fact, there's a lot more in-depth variety, variation, and nuance to their use within a realm that you're being attacked by somebody who's bare-handed for the most part, as opposed to the elements which are directly applicable to weapon practice. So I can understand that the military would have focused on the 5-element fists and then how they apply to the weapons, because they literally can be transposed directly onto the weapons. I mean, it's abundantly clear. So
yeah, and I've written about that, and we used to teach, and one of the reasons I'm a big advocate of that is because when you're in a combat situation, and I've taught building, clearing, and all those kinds of things. So you're in high stress environments. You have to be able to recall that stuff. You have to be able to use it. So if you have one theory for the 5 fists, one theory for the bayonet, one theory for the knife, one theory for the, it's, you'll never be able to do it. You'll fall apart because you won't know. It's like when Mrs. Chang taught the commandos, they would say, they had a saying about how every strike is a block and every block is a strike. So they didn't actually differentiate, like in karate, well, this is an upper block. They would say, okay, the guy throws the punch and you hit him in the bicep. That's your blocking technique, but it's also a strike.
Yeah.
And they did the same thing. They didn't differentiate. And the reason being is you can't say, okay, now do I block? Now do I strike? Now, you know what I'm saying? You get too confused.
Yeah.
So you're spot on with your thinking. Like you're exactly where I would say my teacher would be. Like I said, I've used it training the military. They like it.
Yeah.
There's a funny story about the reconnaissance people. We trained a team of reconnaissance instructors, and then they had to do military exercises with one of the groups was the British Paras.
Okay.
And they got into a fight in a bar on their day off. They had some leave. Anyhow, and the guys, they had just finished training with us for 2 weeks, and they ended up beating the crap out of the British Paras. And those guys are tough guys. I mean, so anyhow, I get a call from the base commander, and we have to go up to the base, and we're in trouble. And the base commander says, these guys went in and they broke these, I think one guy got an arm broken, one guy got a nose broken, but the British Paras got beat up pretty good, and they weren't expecting it. So he says, just so you know, these guys have been docked a week's pay and a bunch of other stuff. And he says, that's the bad news. The good news is great work. So they suspended they said, oh yeah, you don't get paid, you lose a week's pay, and then they gave it back to them for performing so well under stress.
Oh, good.
So it was, so there's some funny stuff in some of my experiences.
Yeah, those are great stories.
But it is. And they were super nice guys. I mean, I got in trouble. I knocked so the PPCLI are a combat group, and they were being deployed to NATO. And the captain I happened to know, he said, can you come in a couple times a week for, a couple of weeks? And they paid, I mean, it was a contract, but it was kind of off the books. They needed some training. And the first time I was there, there was a young guy. He was probably about 20, and I was maybe 42. And he was a boxer, Golden Gloves boxer, young guy. And he said, "Oh, I don't think this stuff's going to work. I'm a boxer, blah, blah, blah." So I said, "Okay." So he came at me and I hit him. I knocked him out. So I got in trouble for, hitting this guy. And he says, "You can't do that." I said, "Look, the guy threw the first punch. I just counterattacked, right?"
Yeah.
And so that was the bad news. But the good news was everybody smartened up, because I said to him, "Look, you're going to go into an area where these people have been in war and they're trained." I said, "I'm an architect. I just knocked your guy out, and I'm an architect. What are you going to do against someone who is serious, who's much better trained than me or more experienced in combat?"
Yeah.
And those are the kind of life lessons sometimes you have to teach.
For sure.
But
for sure.
I wish we didn't have to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, that's part of the process, I think. Sometimes
exactly.
enlightenment has to slap you in the face. It just is the way.
Sometimes. I've had a few of enlightening moments myself, so we won't tell those stories.
I have an old acquaintance. He's a teacher. I think he's in Calgary, if I recall. He's out of Hong Kong. He teaches Mizong Lohan. His name is Alex Kwok. I think he's in Calgary.
Oh yes, he doesn't teach anymore.
He doesn't teach anymore.
Yeah. No.
So
yeah, he was. He might be retired now. He's retired. He's got to be in his 60s.
Yeah, he's retired.
Yeah, he was a computer guy. He worked for the city.
Okay.
He had lived in Vancouver for a number of years, but he's been in Calgary for probably the 70s.
Right.
Something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
He used to be a firecracker when he was younger. He would, if you talk to him and if you know him, you wouldn't think that this guy is a martial artist who doesn't have a problem with hitting you. So he's a very nice guy. He's, very reserved. But, back in the day, he was entering those karate, tournaments and
full contact
and fighting. So... Yeah, he's an old friend of mine, and I mean I haven't spoken to him in a few years, but I know he's retired and he's pretty low key now. So yeah.
Yeah, a friend of mine knows him.
Ah, okay.
I've met him. I don't know him that well. Yeah. Because I wasn't. I'm a kind of the martial art orphan here. I don't really have an organization or a group, or like he was with the Jing Wu school for a long time.
Yes, that's where he came out of in Hong Kong.
So
he came out of the
exactly. Yeah, that's right. So, but for me, I trained with my teacher. There was a small group of us. Most of them dropped off, especially the Xingyi students. I mean, we only ever had probably 6 or 7 students, but most of them never even finished training with my teacher.
I see.
So I'm kind of a martial art orphan in the sense that I don't really have any kind of community.
That's sad.
But, in one way it's sad, but in another way it allows you to remain serious, I think. Because if you teach, like I have a friend of mine, he was a Taekwondo instructor, and he was a legitimate world champion, like the first big world championship they had in Montreal. Okay. He was the winner, and he taught. But it becomes, if you want to make money, you have to teach kids, and then it becomes like babysitting and playing. Exactly. And I'm too old to train the military now. I mean, I could probably hold my own, but maybe I don't want to find out. It'll be one of those stories we can't tell.
Well, at least you've got other goals, and you're keeping your mind, and you're writing, you're thinking, you're researching. So that's the other side.
Yeah, and I still practice. Yeah. I mean, I've picked certain things that I do.
Okay.
And I think if I do those regularly, it's still enough. Yeah. It's not as much as I'd like to do, but there's some things I can't do anymore simply because of, I have aches and pains like everybody else. But I always do my Tai Chi. I do at least my 5 fists in linking form.
Okay, good.
I do Gong Lei Chuan. I do Lembu Chuan. I do the first Junti Chuan and a couple other forms from the military. And it's interesting because my friend who runs the club for the little kids, he came to see me one time, and the Wu Jing they have 5 short forms. They're like 10, 12 moves each, like very basic stuff, right? And I had all my notes, and I had my stuff, and I went downstairs in the basement where I train. I got a nice little training area with pictures of my teachers and everything. And, I spent a week and I relearned the stuff. And then I said, look, here's what you should teach these kids, because they have very little to no training. Yeah. It's good basics. It's something they can do. And, I can teach you the applications. Yeah. And he took it, and that's one of the things he does. I mean, he teaches them other things, but that's one of the things he concentrates on, because
that's great.
They like it. They make progress, and they can do things. They were in this tournament that I went to a few months ago, and they won medals, which helps their ego and confidence. I don't mean ego in a conceited way. I mean sort of their self-esteem and confidence. And it kind of promotes this idea of, traditional arts, even though it's modern, but they get the feel for, what's really going on if you would train with my teachers or your teacher, that kind of a thing.
Oh, that's great.
And yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
So, I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, I talked way longer than I thought.
No, this was great.
I thought this had been like...
it was very enjoyable. I mean, we spoke about some very interesting things. So, I will put whatever links you have that you want to put publicly. If you want people to be able to...
Well, I'm redoing my... So I have 2... sorry, there's a bit of a lag here.
Problem.
I'm not trying to cut
you off.
No
problem. That's like that. Yeah.
So I have two websites. One is sort of the scholarly website. And then the other is, I do expert witness work. I've been an expert witness since 1988. Okay. So I do use of force. I trained healthcare security. So I'm an expert in that field. I've trained, I did a liability reduction handbook for the bar industry. So this is, bouncers, doormen that are always getting sued.
Yeah.
And it was actually endorsed by ACE-INA, which was the second largest insurance underwriter in the world.
Oh, wow.
And they took it and said, hey, this is great stuff. So I'm revising that for republication.
Very good.
I do just about zero teaching now. I don't, maybe somebody wants me to do something, but my next 5 years, I plan on not teaching and doing more writing and research and trying to get at least 1 or 2 more books. I'm doing a book for the university.
Okay.
For the Indigenous Center, it's an academic writing book. It's something totally different. But I want to do more of my own stuff. So the Expert Witness web page, I plan on putting up the older articles like the Xingyi uniform theory article, those kinds of things for people to look at and maybe get some ideas of how to improve their training, or send me nasty emails saying, this is crap. you never know, right? People, I mean, you get all kinds of people.
You do.
And I've kind of got a thicker skin about that, because if you really look at what they've done, most people who criticize you have not had that much experience. So it's kind of like they're talking as, what's it, Dunning-Kruger effect. Totally. They talk as experts, but they don't really know anything about Xingyi.
Yeah.
I had a guy criticize my book, well, this is about, Xingyi. This is a very specialized area. I'll give you 3 stars or whatever. And it's like, it says Xingyi on the cover. I mean, I don't know how do you respond to people like that? I mean, you must see
I get it all the time.
Talking.
I get it all the time.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what I'm saying. Right. And my attitude is, look, I have a lot of knowledge. I don't really go around bragging or publicizing, but I've, 50 years and I've had a lot of sort of adventures, if you want to call them that, or experiences or opportunities is what I like to say.
Yeah.
And I've got a lot of experience, even use of force against law enforcement, things like that. I've done a lot of that kind of work, and I'm very successful at it. I'm not bragging. I've got almost 100% success rate in any of the cases I've been involved in. And I've used this sort of background in martial arts and all this other stuff to do that. So I want to do over the next 4 or 5 years is put out information that people can look at and say, wow, this is valuable. I could get something from this.
Great.
So that's kind of my 5-year goal. And after that, I'm not talking to anybody.
Well, we'll put the links. You'll send them through to me later on. We'll put the links that you want to be made public. And then people can go take a look if they want to get in contact with you, etc. But it's been great talking to you.
Sure.
Thank you for giving me the time today. And I look...
Oh, my pleasure. This has been lots of fun.
Yeah, for me too.
I really appreciate... Yeah. No, I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much. And I look forward to whatever you release, and we'll be in touch. You have a good day. Good evening on your side.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.